Alrighty. We've got 2:30, and I'm so conscious about people's time, especially because it's Friday. So we might kick in. There's a bunch of information that I want to cover off with you. The session is being recorded. You would have gotten that little notification as you were coming in. And yeah, that way you can sort of follow up on the information when it gets shared out by GrowCom. So let's dive in. You should all be able to see my screen, which has got the webinar up there. So topic for today is around workplace sexual harassment. So this topic is not new in any way, shape or form, but there has been some changes to legislation just recently. And so we thought really good opportunity just to do a quick half-hour informative session around what those changes look like. I want to start though with a little bit of a why is this important? Because I think that there is still sometimes a culture of or lack of awareness of this concept of sexual harassment and what it actually is in the workplace. It has become much more prevalent now than what it ever was. There have been a bunch of high profile sexual harassment and assault cases around the world, and that Me Too movement was really starting to heat up, gained a lot of traction back in 2017, so raised a lot more awareness and probably made it that little bit more open for people to actually raise complaints when they had it. And Australia has been very similar. We've had some really high profile cases of late, and it's meant that there's a lot more awareness around it. And it's probably the thing that has pushed as well towards then this Respect at Work movement and the bill that went through. When you think about the scope of this challenge in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace, some of the statistics are really quite scary. So Australian Human Rights Commission did a study in 2022, so very, very recently, found that 77% of Australians who are over 15 years of age have experienced sexual harassment at some point in their lives. Now, that's not saying it's all in the workplace, but sexual harassment at some point. 89% of women have and 64% of men have. In the last 12 months, there's been about 1 in 5 people, so 19% sexually harassed at work. And in the last 5 years, it's 1 in 3. So 33%. So really, really high figures around, high likelihood around sexual harassment. And there again, 41% females and 26% males. It is a feature of our workplaces, unfortunately. It is unacceptable. I guess as you would expect, stereotypically, the majority of sexual harassment in workplaces is carried out by men, and women tend to be the victims of it. Interestingly, about half of the incidents that are included in this study were a repeat incident, as in it happened more than once, and about half of that again had been going on for more than a year. So a year-long situation of sexual harassment. Reporting itself, though, remains really quite low. So we're looking at only 18% of sexual harassment cases being actually reported, which is really quite low. So these statistics that you will see here, they have come about through, the Australian Human Rights Commission actually asking for people to put their hand up to say that they have been sexually harassed. It doesn't mean that they've actually reported it in the work case. That tends to be really quite low. Sorry, I've just had a message come through about people coming on. All good, sorted. Interestingly too, when they asked the respondents, do you feel like you've had like your organisations are doing enough to respond to this issue? A third of Australians said yes. So 2/3 said no, we don't think our workplaces are doing enough. It's also interesting to have a look at, they started to break down where are the incidents of sexual harassment actually happening, as in, in terms of our minority groups as well. So when you break that down further, 47% of people aged between 15 and 17 said that yes, they'd been sexually harassed. 46% of people between 18 and 29. And you can see the statistics there of the percentage of people in these different minority groups who have said, yes, I've experienced some sort of workplace sexual harassment. And those statistics are really, really high. So the incidents are happening disproportionately towards minority groups in our community. So I just want to paint that picture of when you're thinking, oh, does it really happen, or is this something that we really need to be concerned about? It absolutely does happen, and that's why the new legislation has come in. So there's been 3 major changes, all in quite quick succession. And they all play a role in what we need to do in the workplace. So at a work health and safety level, the Workplace Health and Safety Queensland Code of Practice has brought in this concept of psychosocial hazards at work, and it started in April this year. There was also the Fair Work Act, changed from March this year to prohibit workplace sexual harassment. And the Sex Discrimination Act was updated in December 2022, and it put this positive duty on PCBU, so organisations, to eliminate workplace sex harassment. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail around those just so that you understand what it is that has changed. Essentially, the key change is where previously it was an obligation on employers to respond appropriately if it happened, there's now a positive duty on employers to prevent it from happening. That's it in a nutshell. Just to give you a little bit of a refresher on sexual harassment, the definition of sexual harassment is that it's an unwelcome sexual advance or request for sexual favours to the person who is harassed, or other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature in relation to the person who is harassed. So for sexual harassment to happen, it has to be reasonably expected that there's a possibility of the person being harassed, being offended, humiliated, or intimidated by the behaviour. So it means that whether the behaviour is sexual harassment or not actually depends on how a reasonable person would interpret that behaviour. So when you're working out whether or not conduct is sexual harassment, the intention actually doesn't matter. So the intention of the person doing it does not count. What counts is what a reasonable person would perceive it to be. The other important thing with sexual harassment is that it doesn't have to be repeated or continuous. Sexual harassment can be a one-off incident, and that's where it differs from other forms of bullying and harassment in the workplace, which part of the definition is that it's a repeated behaviour. Sexual harassment, not always overly obvious when it's happening, but it is really important to deal with. It can be considered serious misconduct. It can be a valid reason for dismissal from employment if it's serious enough. Sexual harassment can also happen if someone is exposed to or witnesses that kind of behaviour in the workplace. It doesn't even have to happen to them. It might be that they see it happening. They might overhear a conversation, or they might see sexually explicit material in the workplace. If we think about the most common forms, the statistics show what the most common ones are. So sexually suggestive comments and jokes is quite common. Intrusive questions about a person's private life or physical appearance. Inappropriate staring or leering that makes someone feel intimidated. Unwelcome touching, hugging, or cornering or kissing. And inappropriate physical contact. They're all examples of workplace harassment. There are other elements that come into play as well. It can be things like being unnecessarily familiar with someone, deliberately brushing up against them. It can be sexually explicit language in an email or a text message or verbally. It might be an insult or a taunt of sexual nature. Things like unwanted invitations to go out on dates. One by itself, maybe not, but repeated requests when it's being rejected, that can turn into sexual harassment. So there's a number of different forms. And again, it can be a one-off incident. It does not have to be repeated. In terms of where it tends to happen, I found this really quite interesting when they did the survey as to where it happens. So at workstations or places where the person does their work, it occurred 38% of the time there, and 23% of the time in more workplace social areas for the employee, so breakout areas or lunchrooms. So what's actually changed? like I said, there's been 3 major legislative changes. So if we look first at the Work Health and Safety Queensland Code of Practice, the change there is around this introduction of psychosocial hazards at work. So this is an approved code of practice, which means employers must comply with the requirements of this code in Queensland. And just like an employer's got a primary duty of care to provide a safe workplace in relation to physical health, the same actually applies to mental health. So that means that as far as reasonably practicable, that language appears everywhere in work health and safety terms. So as far as reasonably practicable, all employees and others need to be protected from being exposed to psychological health and safety risks and psychosocial hazards, which I'll cover in a moment. And that's anything associated with being in the workplace. So when you look at psychosocial hazards, it is harm that can occur from certain instances, and the harm can be things like anxiety, depression, sleep disorders. It can come out in physical incidents as well. And the failure to comply with this is in line with the work health and safety legislation. So it can be anything from fines for individuals starting at 50,000, it can be jail terms for individuals, and it can go up to about $3 million for corporations. So there's pretty hefty fines when businesses don't adhere to the work health and safety legislation. This idea of psychosocial hazards is a relatively new one, and we're still exploring it a lot to understand what it is exactly that will come of this and what it means for workplaces. And we're not covering that in detail in this. We just want to focus on the sexual harassment part. So we just want to recognise that the very last bullet point there is saying that one of the things identified in the legislation as being a potential psychosocial hazard is harassment, including sexual harassment. So sexual harassment has now been brought under that legislation as well. The second piece of legislation is the Fair Work Act. So workplace sexual harassment is now prohibited under the Fair Work Act. So this came in with the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act in 2022. I'm sure you all remember that coming through. The other really popular thing that came out of that was the zombie agreements being cancelled. But it had an element in there around sexual harassment as well. So from the 6th of March this year, there was an expansion to the previous protections around sexual harassment in the workplace. So before this change came into place, the Fair Work Act didn't actually expressly prohibit sexual harassment. It did allow for things to be indirectly brought to the Fair Work Commission, but it was via other means. So an employee could bring general protections about adverse action on the basis of a workplace right. So if they'd lodged a sexual harassment claim and then were treated unfairly, they could go to Fair Work. It could be general protections against adverse action on the basis of sex, so if they felt like they'd been discriminated against. You could kind of look at it under the anti-bullying jurisdiction. There was some coverage under unfair dismissal if it was because of that. So there was a couple of areas, but never really specifically around sexual harassment. So the Fair Work Commission now, with these changes, has the power to issue orders to stop sexual harassment. So ordering an employer or an employee to stop sexual harassment. And they've got the power to deal with disputes involving sexual harassment and remedy past harm. So when these things go to the Commission now, or if they go to the Commission, they can make a number of different orders. So they can make orders for compensation to a victim. They can make orders for lost wages. So if someone's actually been away from work or as a result of sexual harassment, they might be able to say you need to pay them wages that weren't otherwise paid. And they can also make orders requiring a person to do something that's reasonable to remedy any loss or damage suffered. So again, that order might be to an individual employee or a manager or a workplace. So the way that these matters will be addressed, Fair Work has come out and said, look, there's 3 different ways that we might do this. One is a member conference. So a member conference is a more informal discussion. It's in front of a commission member, and the intent there is conciliation and mediation. So very much a three-way conversation: commission member, victim, organisation, or the person who's doing it. The second way is a determinative conference. So it is more formal, as you can imagine, than a member conference. So the commission member still hears everything, but they are going to make a determination. That session is recorded, it's transcripted, and there's a clear outcome where the commission makes a decision on what happens there. And the last one is a hearing, which is more formal again. Hearings are open to the public, they're open to the media, and the results are published. So this is where there starts to be some potential real reputational damage for people and for businesses. It's going to be up to Fair Work how they handle a complaint when it comes in. And I am going to talk in a moment about what businesses should do so that they're doing everything in their interest to prevent it from going through to that stage. The third major change is the Sex Discrimination Act. So it's been around since 1984, or the last update was 1984. So in 2022, there was an update, and that update introduced a positive duty to employers and PCBUs to eliminate a number of things. They were required to eliminate workplace sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and sex-based harassment. They're required to eliminate conduct that amounts to subjecting a person to a hostile workplace environment on the grounds of sex, and they need to eliminate certain acts of victimisation. There's a whole lot of words in there. So just to explain, sex-based harassment is where there might be verbal abuse or insults or behaviours that aim to marginalise someone on the basis of their sex or gender. One of the types of sex-based harassment is sexual harassment. So a bit of a distinction there. What this legislation means is that employers need to shift their focus to actively preventing workplace sexual harassment and discrimination rather than only responding after it occurs. So that new positive obligation means you need to take proactive and meaningful action to prevent it from happening in the first place. And that includes all of it: sexual harassment, sex discrimination, sex-based harassment, and any conduct that amounts to subjecting a person to a hostile work environment. So when we talk about a hostile work environment, the best way I can describe it, and I still see it sometimes when I walk into workplaces, you walk into the local garage and they still have the pin-up calendar on the wall. That kind of thing is what is described as a hostile workplace environment from a sex-based harassment perspective. And so where previously an employer, shouldn't have, but might have overlooked it, the employer absolutely has a positive duty to stop anything like that from happening. So we talked before about what Fair Work could do. The Australian Human Rights Commission also has new powers. So they are allowed to investigate and they're allowed to enforce compliance with that positive duty. So essentially, it means that employers need to make some changes to make sure that they are complying with those new obligations. And those new obligations come in, I have to check that. I've got 2022 in on the screen and 23 on my notes. I'm pretty sure it's 23 to give businesses time to make sure that they come up to speed with everything that they need to do. So to trigger any of these things, to trigger someone going to Fair Work or to the Commission, it's a complaint. It's a complaint by an individual or individuals in the workplace about sexual harassment. And there's a few ways that a person can make complaints. It can be in the workplace, and actually, to be honest, that's where you want it to start. Or they can apply to the Fair Work Commission now, or they can lodge a complaint with the Australian Human Rights Commission. So people have got a couple of different avenues. What we want to do as employers is make sure that we've got the right stuff in place so that we are channeling them to deal with it within our workplace as much as possible. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, a lot easier to deal with it in the workplace than it is dealing with it through a commission. Two, you've got the opportunity when it's in the workplace to handle it in such a way that you can still have good relationships and maintain relationships, because you get to decide what the process is that you follow, how to make sure that you're protecting individuals as much as possible, what the outcomes should be if sexual harassment has happened. You are working towards, hey, I want to make sure I protect and keep people's relationships. That, as much as Fair Work and the Human Rights Commission might say that's their interest as well, I think we just need to recognise that once it goes formal and it goes outside to a commission, there is so much more chance of damage being done to relationships in the workplace. So what can we do in terms of that proactive prevention? First thing is creating that safe physical and online working environment. So taking a good look at your workplace, taking a good look at, your online content, and having a honest look at, do I have anything in here that might create some discomfort, that might create a hostile environment of a sexual nature, or anything that actually sort of encourages or fosters those sorts of behaviours to come out? You should absolutely be providing information, instruction, training and support around sexual harassment, that it's not acceptable, how to prevent it, what we're going to do if it does happen. If you're seeing unwanted or offensive behaviours in the workplace, you need to be addressing them. This is not something to ignore and think, oh, it's the person hasn't made a complaint, it'll be okay. Or, oh, they were just having a bit of fun. If you are seeing it happening or it is reported to you, you need to deal with it. Having a sexual harassment prevention policy is a really great way to encourage people, A, to be aware of it, B, to don't do it, and C, if it does happen, what's my channel? Who do I go and report it to internally? So you want to encourage that reporting. If it's happening, you want people to be coming and telling management about it. And that means you need an effective complaints procedure so that you know how you're going to handle it if it comes out. Just so that you're aware, these sorts of things, so sexual harassment policy, grievance, dispute and complaint handling policy, those documents are available on the GrowCom shop online as well. So if you don't yet have that in place, absolutely feel free to write those up yourself. But if you want a shorter option, go through to the GrowCom shop for that. I want to touch very briefly as well on the role that we as leaders play in this, because I think that is really important to recognise that we can have policies, we can have procedures, we can have reporting channels, we can have forms, but at the end of the day, people take their measure from us as leaders. And so I think leaders in an organisation play a really critical role in creating that safe and respectful workplace. They're crucial when it comes to setting our framework for preventing and responding to sexual harassment. And really importantly, they role model. They role model what a diverse and inclusive and trusting gender equal culture looks like. So these changes do need commitment from leadership. And if we don't have that, the workplace will struggle to adopt or embrace the right mindset and approach that we need to get rid of sexual harassment in our workplaces. So leadership goes across preventative and responsive measures in this space. It's being really clear that we don't want it. It's doing everything right to prevent it from happening. And then if it does happen, responding in the right way. And that applies to small and large businesses alike. So I think it's really important that your people are aware of your commitment as a leader to stop this from happening or prevent it from happening. So communication, as always, is a massive key on this. So appropriately modelling those behaviours, being clear about your policy, giving updates, giving training sessions, including it in toolbox talks, whatever the right avenue is for you, making sure your communication around this stuff is clear and consistent. There is a bunch of really great resources available. They're put out by a number of people actually. So there's a Respect at Work website. It's got content on there around, all of the stuff we've just spoken about today. It's got videos in there. The Fair Work Commission has put out some sexual harassment at work online learning modules. It's actually really good. I don't say that too often. I often kind of look at some of that material that's generated and think, it's not hitting home hard enough or appropriately for a workplace. But these sexual harassment online training modules, I actually thought they were really good. They're interactive. They're choose your own story so that you get to see different outcomes. Safe Work Australia has also put out information, and depending on what state or territory you're in, you should be Googling or looking up your own state or territory work health and safety body, because quite often they have put material out as well that's really, really helpful. So I'd encourage you to jump in and have a look at those resources as well. And that covers all the content with 4 minutes to spare. So